Isaiah chapter 13. So if you guys remember last week,
I don't remember.
you know what? It wasn't last week. Yeah, we didn't do Isaiah last week. 2 weeks ago, there was the pictures of the Davidic, there was this hopeful picture of creation being restored, right? And we had the picture of the Messiah and the peace that he brings. Earlier on in Isaiah, we saw the peace between man. And then this last picture, it was kind of a peace with creation, right? We had those, if you go back into Isaiah chapter 11, you saw where the wolf lies down with the lamb and the kids can play in the snake's den and like all kind of stuff where there was this Edenic picture that we got. And then there was that awesome song in Isaiah 12, the song of salvation that was sung. And we looked at that and said, man, it's like a song we could sing, knowing that on this side of the Messiah, we own all those things, that God was angry at us, yet his wrath is satisfied by the victory won through the Messiah. And he turned his anger away, and now he's had compassion on us. He is our strength and our song. He has become our salvation. Just a really cool section of scripture. We draw joyfully from the wells of salvation. And I talked about how cool that was, that how they implemented that at the time of the Feast of Tabernacles. And that's actually when Jesus stood up in the quiet time of the Feast of Tabernacles and he said, all of you who are thirsty, come to me and drink, and I will give you living water. It will flow out of your innermost being. And so that was actually the fulfillment of this song. So pretty cool picture there. Beyond pretty cool, actually. It's like amazing. So in verse 13, it shifts a little bit. And as we see here, in verse 1, it says, an oracle against Babylon that Isaiah the son of Amos saw. So who's this section of Isaiah written to? Babylon, right? Do you guys know kind of in the time period what's going on in Babylon right now? Do you know anything in Isaiah's day? What's Babylon up to?
Pretty small.
They're not the Babylon that you would know about. It's about 100 years prior to the southern kingdom's captivity to Babylon, where then Babylon is this conquering world power, right? So in light of things, Babylon is not that yet, right? But they exist. They're around. They're kind of subservient to Assyria at the time.
I think I was looking up that Daniel came after Isaiah, right?
Correct.
There was, I think, at least 100 years.
About 100 years, yes.
And then another almost 200 years until the Greek army came through. So I'm just, because Daniel was prophesying, but there's like hundreds of years.
Hundreds of years.
Are like separating very specific.
Yeah, and that's what actually makes this section really interesting. Because as they talk about Babylon in here, I'm going to take these in pretty big chunks, okay? We could talk about it if we need to, but some of this stuff is just pronouncements of judgment, and it all goes together. It's not something you really need to break down line by line, okay? But what I do want you to see here is the amazing thing of this is written as if Babylon is a world superpower, as if they've already decimated Jerusalem and things like that. So Isaiah is actually looking in the future about 100 years at this point when he's saying this. So the original audience, when they heard this, is kind of like, Babylon? Like, what are you talking about? And not only that, he actually name drops another country that they really would have been like, what are you talking about? But we know from history, there's some really significant prophecies being dropped right here in this section. So let me read this. An oracle against Babylon that Isaiah the son of Amos saw. Lift up a banner on a barren mountain and call out to them. Wave your hand and they will go through the gates of the nobles. I have commanded my chosen ones. I have also called my warriors who exult in my triumph to execute my wrath. Listen, a tumult on the mountains like that of a mighty people. Listen, an uproar among the kingdoms like nations being gathered together. The Lord of hosts is mobilizing an army for war. They are coming from a far land, from the distant horizon. The Lord and the weapons of his wrath to destroy the whole country. Now, as we go through here, just to help you with the timeline before we get into this, I will tell you there's debate on the timeline of some of this stuff, mainly because Babylon, sometimes in Scripture, is not just physically talking about the land of Babylon. There seems to be a spiritual nation and nature to Babylon as well, okay? So if you could think about that in the book of Revelation, Babylon is talked about there, but it's never talking actually about the land of Babylon. It's more like the spiritual nature of Babylon. Babylon has always been kind of seen in the scriptures as this place of the opposite of God's people, right? There's actually a book called A Tale of Two Kingdoms or Two Cities or something like that. Or The Tale of Two Babylons, I think it's called, or something like that. There's physical Babylon and spiritual Babylon, right? And why do you think that is?
Wait, his name is Luca?
Do you got any idea of why you think that is? Why is Babylon typified as this spiritual city of darkness? Okay, use that as an example. So, but why specifically Babylon in particular? What happened in Babylon?
What happened in Babylon? Or last question?
Either one. Let's let Daniel finish his thought first. Sorry. Okay. Go ahead,
I think
and then I'll get you.
Babylon, it's just God is using it like, do not be like these people when they were powerful. Like,
Okay.
do not be like that, and it uses it like an example of like Satan or
Okay.
devil
Interesting. Okay.
or something.
Okay.
So, if I
Thank you,
remember right, Babylon physically at that time was a religious center. It was a place where people of one or more pagan religions would come and worship.
Okay.
So it was a center of worship, and I think like that's kind of what its claim to fame was up until they ramped up to become more of a power.
World power. And and what else? Where does that have its roots too? Why would Babylon be this place of spiritual darkness and worship? The Tower of Babel, right? Yeah, like we don't need to overcomplicate. You know what I mean? Like there's a reason. Like this is the place. God wipes out the all the evil from the earth, and then in a few generations, they're building a tower to the heavens to attempt to combat God, and they want to be and seemingly too they're getting into these practices that maybe were the things that called down the fallen angels and the wicked powers and stuff. So there's something in Babylon and something there that just has that the symbolism ends up just being spiritual darkness, pagan worship, right? Okay? So keep that in mind a little bit. Now, I think when we look at this, although people want to push all this off into the spiritual, I don't think we can. There are things I think we can make application there, but I think as we read this, I want you to have your discernment up to realize too, there's a lot that's being talked about here is for them. It's right there. It's talking about the physical Babylon, okay? So now here, this says it's an oracle, right? In line with that, this is an oracle against Babylon, right? This is God's pronouncement of judgment against Babylon. So when he's talking about raising an army up and he's talking about decimating the area, who's he talking about this coming against? Is it?
Babylon?
Who's the oracle against? Who's he speaking against?
Babylon.
He's talking to Babylon. And if you go forward, he's going to have an oracle against Assyria. He's going to have an oracle against Philistia, an oracle against Moab. So this is Babylon's judgment. This is where I think some people get this wrong, and they push it so far in the future, and they spiritualize Babylon, and then they make this against Israel. This isn't against Israel, if you look at it for what it is, right? I think that has importance if you're going to understand the context, okay? You can wrestle with this and you figure it out, on your own, but...
Chapter 14 it kind of gives a clue that it wasn't for Israel, right?
I think so too. So we'll keep working through it and we'll get to that. Yep. So let's listen. So God's raising up something against Babylon here. Now listen to what it says. Wail, verse 6. Wail, for the day of the Lord is near, and it will come like destruction from the Almighty. Therefore, everyone's hands will become weak, everyone's heart will melt, they will be horrified, with pain and agony will seize them. They will be in anguish like a woman in labor. They will look at each other, and their faces will be flushed with fear. Look, the day of the Lord is coming, cruel with rage and burning anger, to make an earth a desolation and destroy the sinners in it. Now again, you get this language of the day of the Lord, right? And again, this is sometimes where people get, it can be tough to pin it down because as we've talked about, we have to be very careful with how we read the scriptures because even though the day of the Lord is talked about in here, is there only one day of the Lord? What do you think? Is there only one day of the Lord? I don't think so. I think as you go through here, you can see the day of the Lord is symbolic for God's judgment. And at multiple times, the day of the Lord came, right? And the day of the Lord will come, but it has come. And some people, when they read this, they hear day of the Lord and they immediately go to the end of time. I don't know that you can in this context, right?
It seems it's because there hasn't been a day of the Lord for a long time.
Yeah, and that could be too, right?
And that's why maybe in that day it was happening more often.
Yeah. And so now listen, now pick up on this because this is interesting, okay? Listen, where have you heard some of this verbiage before? Where have you heard some of these words before? The day of the Lord is coming, cruel with rage and burning anger, to make the earth a desolation and to destroy the sinners on it. Indeed, the stars of the sky and its constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark when it rises. The moon will not shine. I will bring disaster on the world and on their own iniquity and on the wicked. I will put an end to the pride of the arrogant and humiliate the insolence of tyrants. I will make man scarcer than gold and mankind more rare than the gold of Ophir. Therefore, I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will shake on its foundations at the wrath of the Lord and the day of his burning anger. Like wandering gazelles and sheep without a shepherd, each one will turn to his own people, and they will flee to his own land. Whoever is found will be stabbed. Whoever is caught will die by the sword. Their children will be smashed to death before their eyes. Their houses will be looted, and their wives will be raped. Listen, this is not a pretty picture, okay? But where do we hear language like this?
We're done with that. No, we're done with it. Dad says it's a little too loud when we go crazy.
Yeah, Revelation, right? You look at some of this, and you go, this is very apocalyptic language, right?
It sounds a bit like Revelation.
It sounds a lot like Revelation. And so that's an important note that I want you to see. And this is sometimes why people will push this off into the future, right? They're going, well, this sounds like what Jesus talked about in Matthew 24. It sounds like what is being talked about in Revelation. So it must be in the future. This must not be dealing with this time. It must be pushed into the future.
And Babylon is mentioned specifically in Revelation.
And Babylon as well, right? And that would be like a spiritual Babylon, right? So I understand, whether you come to the conclusion this in the future or whatever, I do understand the position. I think people have some grounds for this. I do actually think it's wrong, and I'm going to show you why. But the first thing I want you to see is Revelation is not the only place that talks about the constellations falling, the sun turning dark, and all this kind of stuff, right? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, God's judgment, when he displays his judgment, he does it in specific ways.
Yeah.
So just because he did it a certain way or another, doesn't mean he'll do the same
Right.
similar stuff.
Right. And so did you guys ever get into a fight? And let me put my cards on the table. Let's read the next verse. The next verse says, "Look, I am stirring up the Medes against them, who cannot be bought off with silver and who have no desire for gold." I'll read the next two verses. "Their bows will cut young men to pieces. They'll have no compassion on the little ones, and they will look with pity on the children." Who is the fulfillment of the earth falling down on the Babylonians? So we just got that picture, right? The Lord said, "I'm sending my judgment. It's going to be the day of the Lord, and the sky's going to turn dark, and the constellations are going to fall, and your hearts are going to faint, and I'm bringing disaster upon you. The heavens are going to tremble. The earth is going to shake in its foundations. Everybody, kids are going to get smashed to death before your eyes, and your wives are going to be raped." It's like a bad picture. The earth is going to fall upon the Babylonians. And how does that happen? According to what we read here.
It comes through the Medes.
The Medes take over their country.
And
So
it's funny, he says they won't be bought by silver or gold.
right.
And Daniel's message to the king of Babylon that was about to be conquered was,
Yeah.
you've been weighed and measured and found wanting.
Yeah.
Talking about money.
Which is money. It's gold. Yep.
It's all money.
Yep. So let me ask you something. Do you think that when it's talking in here, I'm not asking you about Revelation yet or anything like that. I'm saying in here, do you think that the sun being dark, that this constellations not giving their light, that the earth being shaken, is this literal or is this poetic?
Probably
It seems pretty poetic. So when you study literature at this time, okay, not only this kind of literature, but you could see this in Middle Eastern writing all over. You see this in Babylonian texts, Assyrian texts, and they write like this. When they were talking about how they were going to come in and decimate another country, if they were talking a bad game, it's hyperbole. It would be like the world was falling on them, right? Like it would be similar to us. Remember when we were kids and we'd be like, "I'm going to hit you so hard, your mama hurts." You know what I mean? Like, your mom's going to feel like literally that's what's going on. When you study the text, it seems like that's what's going on here. The Lord is speaking in an exaggerated, hyperbolic way. What is that word? Hyperbolic?
Yeah.
Hyperbolic? Yeah.
Hyperbolic.
Hyperbolic way. And he's speaking in terms of judgment. This is the way they talk when they were when a neighboring country. And if you remember, we actually talked about this earlier when the Assyrians came in. Remember, he talked to Israel and said, "Your hearts are going to faint. It's going to be like the heavens shaking and all this." And he said, "The Assyrians are going to come and take you over." This was common, exaggerated language to speak about the changing of a kingdom and the overtaking of a nation. Okay? And so what makes this very interesting is, not only at the time was Babylon not a power, the Medes were even less of a power. And if you said that Babylon was going to rise to power and be this national influence, people might go, "Okay, maybe." But then if you say the people that are going to judge Babylon is going to be the Medes, they'd be like, "The Medes? No way. There's no way. This is crazy talk." Yet what do we know about history? Babylon rose to power and took over the world. And then it was the Medes that came in and took them over, the Persians and the Medes. And interestingly enough, if you study some history, just to give it to you before I move on a little bit, some of this stuff is progressively fulfilled. You talked about the other week, the Medes actually took over the Babylonians without even killing anybody. Like their initial overtaking and taking of the city of Babylon was they diverted their stream of water that nobody could ever get through. Their forces, their wall and moat was like impenetrable. So they were so arrogant because nobody could ever get in. Yet there was a weakness in a spot, and the Medes were diligent enough to redirect the water and then cross in through and sneak in, and they overcame them when they were in the midst of a party, a drunken party, which the book of Daniel talks about that, you know? So that's pretty neat. But what you don't see, as we continue on here, it's going to talk about the decimation of Babylon, how bad it's going to get destroyed. And that actually happens a little bit later. There's writings from the Medes and the Persians about how there was an uprising a few years later in Babylon, how Babylon initially they left it and it was going to be, they were just going to kind of assimilate and those kind of things. But then there was an uprising in Babylon and they just came in and destroyed them. They came in and decimated it. The city stuck around for a while. Actually, Babylon is where Alexander the Great sets up his kingdom. His headquarters was in Babylon. And then eventually even that gets knocked out. And to this day, Babylon is nothing. It's never been really rebuilt. Saddam Hussein, if you want to even take it into more modern days, Saddam Hussein started rebuilding some of the towers and different things in Babylon, but those were destroyed again. They've never really been inhabited anymore since then. So let's read about what it says is going to continue to happen. And any questions or thoughts on any of that kind of stuff? But I did want to show you I think it's very interesting, and I think we have to be honest with the text, that the clear fulfillment of the decimating of Babylon in the catastrophic language is the Medes. It was the Medes coming in. That's what it says, right? Go ahead.
What are some of the other examples where they aren't like this in that time period?
So off the top of my head, I don't know specific writings, but if you do some research on it, there, like I said, not just this, but you get that in any like apocalyptic literature in that area, like Babylonian texts, Assyrian texts, Sumerians, like they do the exaggeration of war speak is pretty well known in history for conquering countries and stuff like that. So off the top of my head, I can't give you a specific text, but I know researching those things that exist. And many people in the church will also point to Revelation and go, that's all that's happening there too. It's a very similar thing. I mean, it's literally the exact same words. Jesus, you can make the case that Jesus was doing the same thing. Because many people look at the way Jesus was talking about and the sun and the moon, being pulled, and that was seemingly symbolic of the Romans coming in and destroying the temple and destroying all that stuff. That was the exact same kind of a scenario where you have a pronouncement or a prophecy saying that a nation or a system is going to be toppled, and then the fulfillment of that is a neighboring army coming in and destroying them. Will there be a time when everything gets rolled up as a scroll that everything's going to be burned up with fire and the sun and the moon go dark because God destroys them and things? Yeah, there'll be a time like that, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that when these things are being talked about, that it's actually a literal fulfillment of those things happening in that way. It very well could be, and I think in many cases is just exaggerated hyperbole of language to talk about the changing of the guard or a terrible time of destruction of a neighboring king coming in and destroying. Yeah.
I think too, one of the reasons it's kind of hard to interpret these kind of prophecies is we now know from the New Testament perspective, because we've been told this explicitly, that there is the physical nations of the world and there is the spiritual forces behind the nations that are manipulating them. So the Bible can be talking about both of those things.
Yeah.
and it gets confusing to discern.
Yeah. Yep. And two, many of us bring baggage to the table, right? Many of us have come up, if you've grown up in the church, under a certain set of teaching. So instead of reading the Bible for the Bible, we read the Bible in light of things we've heard and things we've heard other people say, which I'm not saying don't do that. God gives the church teachers, but we do need to inherently recognize that in certain areas, particularly when it comes to prophecy and particularly when it comes to eschatology, the study of end things that are still a little murky, that are in the far off, there are differing opinions, and you may have not ever heard them, or you may have grown up hearing, oh, it was wrong and there's another way and that's the right way, and yet you never really explored the other ways to find out what makes more sense and what is actually more consistent, right? So we bring bias to the scriptures. We don't, as much as we want to, we should be seeking to not do that. Let's come to the scriptures and say, let's let the text be the text. And if that matches with the system I think I'm in, great. If it doesn't, be open and willing to wrestle with it a little bit and challenge it a little bit, because maybe you've been wrong. Maybe your favorite teacher is wrong. Hey, some of my favorite teachers, I think they're wrong in certain areas. It's okay. I'm allowed to have a different opinion. So are you. You can have a different opinion than me. In fact, I expect you to, right? If you're really being a good student of the scriptures, I think there's going to be areas where we sharpen each other and we're not on the same page on everything. That's okay. We agree on the main things. But some of this apocalyptic stuff, this stuff that is hard to discern, it's okay. It's not the end of the world, right? Stars aren't falling. We're good. We can wrestle through it. We can come to understand things to a greater degree, okay? We can sharpen each other. Does that make sense? There's some digging we got to do. All right, so as we go through here, it says, look, I'm stirring up the Medes against them who cannot be bought off with silver, who do not have desire for gold. Their bows will cut young men to pieces. They will have no compassion on the little ones. They will look with no pity on the children. And Babylon, the jewel of the kingdoms and the glory of the pride of the Chaldeans, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. It will never be inhabited or lived in from generation to generation. A nomad will not pitch its tent there. The shepherds will not let their flocks rest there, but desert creatures will lie down there, and owls will fill their houses. Ostriches will dwell there. Wild goats will leap about. Hyenas will howl in their fortresses, and jackals in their luxurious palaces. Babylon's time is almost up, and her days are almost over. So here, on the surface, you might go, well, this is interesting. But there is some of what Rob talked about. And actually in 14, you get some more of this too. And this is why I hold these things in tensions. I'm not like super dogmatic about a specific position. There may be some of what Rob was talking about. This physical nature of things, but the spiritual nature going on as well. Let me tell you why. Starting in verse 21. This is what my version reads. The desert creatures will lie down there. Owls will fill their houses. Ostriches will dwell there. Wild goats will leap about. Hyenas will howl in their fortresses. And jackals in their luxurious places. Okay? Babylon's time is almost up. Her days are numbered. In the original language, all those animals that are listed there, there's actually only 3 different, if you want to call them, I'll say creatures, that are listed here. Modern translations insert other things. But when you go into the sources of the original words that are put here, and the closest thing to here, what it says inhabits Babylon are the howling ones, the satyrs, and the dragons. That's very interesting. I will ask the question, is this basically saying something like, when they are driven out in this land that we know is dark and spiritually ugly and false worship and just the symbol of all that is ungodly and bad, the only thing that's going to be left to dwell there is going to be these dark entities? Are the howling ones and the dragons and the satyrs, which are usually depicted as dark spiritual entities or dark creatures, are they going to be what's left in the land? Is it just going to be this deserted, dark area? It's interesting. I think that's very interesting. I also find this is one of the areas where I go like, man, towing the line between truth and myth is very interesting, because when you see the scriptures talk about things like a satyr or a dragon, and you see that in so much literature and even in areas of history, when you see those things crop up, you go, oh, I thought they were kind of just mythical or whatever. It's very interesting to see how non-mythical, right, they're treated at times, And when I say mythical, I don't mean it didn't exist. I'm saying maybe these are spiritual entities that are being talked about. Maybe this is something that is beyond the physical realm. That's being, looking into the unseen realm of things. Because as far as I know, I've never seen a goat man, an evil goat man. But that's what a satyr is, I've never seen a physical dragon. Now, and there are historical accounts for such things, but I know the Bible speaks of them many, many times as Satan is, typologically called the serpent and the dragon of old and those things, right? Yeah, a sea monster. It's the same word. It's the same word. It's the sea monsters. When the Bible in its original language talks about sea monsters, it's that word. So it's very interesting. So, take that for what it's worth, okay? But we see some of that. Maybe there is, and as we go along here, you okay if I just do a little bit more? And I'll go pretty quick, I think. All right? So as we continue on, again, this is over Israel, Babylon, but listen, so here's why Babylon is going to be crushed. Here's why the Medes come in. This is also a hint to the timeline, in my opinion, right? This is a hint to the timeline. He's saying, so this is all going to happen because the Lord will have compassion on Jacob and will choose Israel again. He will settle them in their own land. The foreigner will join them and be united with the house of Jacob. The nations will escort Israel and bring them back to its homeland. Then the house of Israel will possess them as male and female slaves in the Lord's land. They will make captives of their captors and will rule over the oppressors. Think of the timeline here. What happens when the Medes and the Persians come to power? They allow Israel to go back in the land. Right? So you get the fulfillment. You're seeing it. Why? Now there's still seemingly more to this, right? Because now at some point foreigners are going to join into Israel. And again, I think this looks to the new covenant a little bit. Because it's saying foreigners are going to become a part of the house of Jacob. How do foreigners become part of the house of Jacob? What does the New Testament say about people who become part of the house of Jacob? How does that happen? And it's in Christ, right? We're grafted in. So, again, there is some far-looking stuff here too, right? But you see a victory over the nations happening. And that only happens through the Messiah. So, now verse 3. When the Lord gives you rest from your pain and torment and the hard labor you were forced to do, you will sing this song of contempt about the king of Babylon and say, okay, so before we read this song, who is this song to?
The king of Babylon.
To the king of Babylon. How the oppressor is quieted down, how the raging has become quiet. The Lord has broken the staff of the wicked and the scepter of the rulers. It struck the people in anger and unceasing blows. It subdued the nations in rage with relentless persecution. All the earth is calm and at rest. People shout with a ringing cry, and the cypresses and the cedars of Lebanon rejoice over you. Since you have been laid low, no woodcutter has come against us. Sheol is eager to greet your coming. Who's this talking about? The grave is eager to greet your coming. Who's the song to?
King of Babylon.
King of Babylon. Okay, just keep this in mind. He stirs up the spirits of the departed for you, all the rulers of the earth. He makes the kings of the nations rise from their thrones, and they all respond to you, saying, you too have become weak as we are. You have become like us. Your splendor has been brought down to Sheol, or the grave, along with the music of your harps. Maggots are spread out under you, and worms cover you. Who's that to?
The king of Babylon.
Okay, just now, here's a part of contention in the text, and this is why I'm telling you this. When I read this in my version, you may not even think twice about it, but I'll tell you why it's become a place of contention. Next verse 12. Shining morning star, how you have fallen from the heavens. You destroyer of nations, you have been cut down to the ground. You said to yourself, I will ascend to the heavens. I will set up my throne above the stars of God. I will sit at the mount of God's assembly in the remotest parts of the north. I will ascend above the highest clouds, and I will make myself like the Most High. But you will be brought down to the Sheol, to the deepest regions of the pit. Those who see you will stare at you as they will look closely at you. Is this the man who caused the earth to tremble, who shook the kingdoms, who turned the world into a wilderness and destroyed its cities, who would not release prisoners to return home? All the kings of the nations lie in splendor, each in his own tomb, but you are thrown out without a grave, like a worthless branch, covered by those slain with the sword, and you are dumped into a rocky pit like a trampled corpse. You will not join them in burial because you destroyed your land and slaughtered your own people. The offspring of evildoers will never be remembered. Prepare a place of slaughter for his sons, because the iniquity of the fathers, they will never rise up and possess a land or fill the earth with its cities. Who is that talking to? King of Babylon.
Also,
Okay, yeah, and this is the argument that people have with this. Is this giving two pictures? Is this to the king of Babylon that there's something looking beyond the veil, if you want to put that, to also Satan and what happened with him? I'm going to leave it in your hand. I'll be honest with you, for a long time, I came up and always just thought, because I always took for granted that it was Satan. It was always talking about Satan. And the only reason, the reason for that is because in verse 12 it says shining morning star, right? Yeah. And in the King James Version of the Bible, right there it says, O Lucifer. Because when they translated the King James Version, instead of translating morning star, they stuck with the Latin. And the Latin word for morning star is Lucifer. Okay? So nowhere else in the scriptures is Lucifer a name for Satan, though I will tell you, you don't see it anywhere else. In fact, it's actually a term Jesus takes upon himself in Revelation. So I think there can be an issue if you attribute this to Satan, if you go, unless now to explain that away, they go, well, Jesus says he's the true and morning star. But nowhere does it say true and morning star or other morning star, right? It just says Lucifer, right? But Lucifer doesn't have to mean Satan. Lucifer could just mean morning star, the bright one, the shiny one, right? Which is an appropriate term for Jesus. Now, yes, you know what happened with Satan, right? You know how in pride he wanted to be like the Most High. You know those things, right? Where do you know those things from? Do you? What?
Probably these verses.
These verses. Do you know anywhere else? You know there was a rebellion. You know that they were cast out. You know that Satan is an enemy of God, right? You know that he challenges God in Job and different things like that. But many things you only know, or maybe think you know, because you've attributed this to Satan. But in its context, who is it to? And what do we know about what the king of Babylon did? What happened to Nebuchadnezzar? What did God do to Nebuchadnezzar and why?
He humbled him like a beast.
Why did he humble him like a beast? Because he wanted to be like God, and he exalted himself up. I'm not saying Satan doesn't do these things, okay? Don't hear me wrong. Clearly they are of their father when they go that route, right? Clearly there is a satanic spirit that exalts itself, it wants to be high. So don't hear me wrong. I'm just saying if we're true Bible students, we've got to realize and we've got to be able to go a little bit deeper and say, like, maybe we've attributed things that we don't fully know, or maybe maybe there's more to the story, right? Maybe this at its face value is just talking about the king of Babylon. And that doesn't take anything away from how evil Satan is and what he did or whatever. It's just this text may just be talking about the king of Babylon. And that's okay too. Right? Because that's just as true. I will ascend to the heavens, which is also, if you look at this, I think it's interesting too, because it says, I will sit on the mount of God's assembly. You go, well, that's a spiritual being or whatever. Interestingly enough, kings of the earth are always put, you can go to Psalm 89, I think it is, or whatever, where the kings of the earth are a part of God's assembly. So, I mean, you kind of, there's some difficult stuff there, right? Right, they're appointed there, yeah. And we actually are told that we become a part of God's assembly, right? So, anyway, I just wanted to wrestle with some of that stuff with you a little bit. Get your gears turning. Because I want us to be students of the text. I don't want you to just take things and receive it just because you hear it or whatever. I want you to wrestle with this stuff. I want you to figure this out. Now let's finish up in 22, and it says, I will rise up against them, against Babylon. And this is the declaration of the Lord of hosts. And I will cut off from Babylon her reputation, her remnant, her offspring, and posterity. This is the Lord's declaration. I will make her a swampland and a region for screech owls, and again, that's howling ones. And I will sweep her away with a broom of destruction. This is the declaration of the Lord of hosts. What's important about all this? Why do we dive in on all this? Because God's word is true. Because Babylon, this prophecy was 100 years before Babylon was even a world power. And not only did Babylon rise to be a world power, not only did their ruler become humbled and get casted down in the sight of all the nations, just as it said here, but then they got overtaken by the Medes, who were nothing, just like it said here, hundreds of years before it happened. And not only that, but to this day, Babylon is a place that is relatively desolate and no one lives there. It's not do you know of Babylonians today? Do you know of people that live in the area of Iraq or are they just tent dwellers? And they don't even really live there. They live in surrounding areas and they just pass by that area. It's deserted.
Yeah,
it's destroyed.
There are some modern settlements nearby that are starting to kind of encroach on the ruins, but
right.
Very much like a modern town that was placed there and is like co-opting the
right.
ruins, destroying them so they can have more space for their stuff.
Yeah.
It's not the same city that
right.
originally.
Her remnant, her people, her reputation destroyed. Right?
How many years was it?
I think about 100 or so, because if you look like Jared, Jared or Rob was saying, from Isaiah's time to the Babylonian captivity is about 100 years, and then from Daniel to the Greeks is another 100 years. Okay, so in that time period, it's getting decimated. Babylon's not completely destroyed then, though, yet, because Alexander the Great sets up in Babylon, but it's then after his day when that is laid waste and stuff like that. So again, you get maybe 200 years or so. So right around that time period. And then progressively, we see now for the last 2,000 plus years, pretty much inhabited, pretty much desolate, right? To where now the only time you think of Babylon is when it's spiritualized. You're looking for the spiritual Babel, right? You know? And again, let's take this as well. Let's take this to the next level and realize God defeats his enemies, right? No matter what you're looking at. When pride is exalted, when nations come against God's people, the Lord wins. The Lord will have his justice. The Lord, there is a day coming, the day of the Lord, and a final day when Christ the Messiah returns, and he will conquer all the kings of the earth. And everyone will look upon him and wail. When everything will be brought in subjective to him.
It's almost like a picture of believer, unbeliever, too.
Yeah.
Think about it.
Yep. So yes, we have physical and we have spiritual meaning. We can get that. So let's pray, and then we can talk more if we want to. But Lord, thank you for your word. And as we chew on this stuff and as we wrestle through it a little bit, I just pray that your Holy Spirit would bring to us clarity and help us to discern and make important what's important, and also be able to give room and grace to the areas where we're still recognizing that we're figuring this out together, that we're sharpening each other, that there may be things in here that are apocalyptic and yet to come, and yet there is so much that is fulfilled and that we can know and we can understand, and we can see in history your faithfulness, and we can see in history your victory. And we can see your power and your might and your glory as you tell us things that happen before they happen. And now as we look back on that, we trust you and we realize your great glory and power. And so, Father, until Christ returns, we look forward to the day when all spiritual darkness will be crushed. We look forward to the day when nations will seek your face and they will look to you, and you will come for your people, and you will gather us together from all areas of the earth, and we will dwell with you forever. Lord, help build us up with these things. Help us to purify ourselves and to build each other up in unity and in grace and in Christ. Amen.